Since starting Hollywood Graveyard 6 years ago, one of the common questions I'm asked is, what are my favorite famous graves? I'll admit that's not an easy question to answer. I've visited countless graves across the globe over the years, and many of them have had some special significance. But in an effort to answer that question, I've narrowed down, in no particular order, my top 10 famous graves. And I thought it would be a fun way to kick off 2023 and mark 6 years of Hollywood Graveyard by sharing them with you. I should note that these are entirely subjective. This isn't a list of the most famous graves in the world, but graves that have had special meaning to me based on who the individual was, or perhaps the unique nature of the site, or a bit of both. And I should also note that this list is limited to graves I have personally visited, and doesn't include graves we've featured on the channel that were submitted by viewers. So join me on this personal journey as I share with you my favorite famous graves. And I hope that afterward you'll share in the comments what your favorite famous graves are that you've visited, and why they were meaningful to you. I can think of no better place to begin today than Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. It's the only cemetery in the world with a view of the Hollywood sign to the north, shares a wall with a movie studio to the south, and has peacocks proudly strutting through the cemetery among the tombstones. With movie screenings on the grounds and other cultural events, Hollywood Forever truly embraces its place in the middle of Hollywood. Ipso facto, it was the very first cemetery I ever visited after moving here to LA years ago. And the very first famous grave I ever visited in LA? Well, that was the grave of Mel Blanc. Probably not most people's first choice in a city full of huge stars, but for me, a cartoon lover, Mel Blanc was about as big a star as there was. I was also fascinated by the witty epitaph, the catchphrase of one of the many characters he voiced, Porky Pig.
That's all, folks.
That's all, folks, famously closed out Warner Brothers cartoons, inscribed here now to close out a magnificent life. Known as the man of 1,000 voices, Mel Blanc was one of the most versatile voice actors of the 20th century, voicing most of the male characters in Warner Brothers cartoons, like Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Tweety and Sylvester, Yosemite Sam, Foghorn Leghorn, and more. He voiced characters for other studios as well, like Barney Rubble, and even the Raven on the Munsters. Mel Blanc's voice was everywhere, and he would appear in front of the camera as well, as a regular on shows like the Jack Benny program. Among Mel's final films are Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Jetsons the Movie. He died from heart disease and emphysema at age 81. Mel's was the only grave I visited that day, as the cemetery closed shortly after I arrived, and they kicked me out. A few days later, I sought out the second famous grave I visited in LA. If you've seen our previous videos, you know where we are now. Yes, the second famous grave I visited was a longtime hero of mine, Walt Disney, here at Forest Lawn, Glendale, in a garden outside the Freedom Mausoleum. I think, like many people, at first I was very surprised by the humble nature of the grave. There are arguably fewer bigger names in the entertainment world than Walt Disney, and one might expect a grand monument to the man. But for Walt, the grand monument is Disneyland. This humble site is simply where a portion of his ashes was buried. The small family garden marked by a miniature replica of the Little Mermaid statue. Walt Disney is a man who needs no introduction, and we've featured him multiple times on our channel, including our Disney special. But let's recap briefly the life and career of the man whose name has become synonymous with wholesome family entertainment. Young Walt started his own animation company, Laugh-O-Gram, in his hometown of Kansas City, before moving out to Los Angeles to start Disney Brothers Studios. There he produced a series of live-action animation hybrid shorts called the Alice Comedies. Their breakout came in 1928 when they introduced a new character to the world, Mickey Mouse, in a short called Steamboat Willie, in which many people saw sound synced with a cartoon for the first time. In the years that followed, he produced the first cel animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and brought the world Disneyland. Walt died from complications of lung cancer in 1966 at age 65. While we're here, let's head into the Freedom Mausoleum, and a grave I visit every time I come to Forest Lawn, Glendale. In the Sanctuary of Heritage is the crypt of Gracie Allen and George Burns. This 2-for-1 entry in my top 10 is an example of what has become one of the nice unintended consequences of Hollywood Graveyard, and that is being introduced to new entertainers and their work. It's fun to visit stars you already know, and equally as fun, to meet some new ones along the way. I vaguely knew of George Burns as the gravel-voiced, cigar-toting, bespectacled funny man who lived to the ripe old age of 100, but I had never heard of Gracie Allen, and I was wholly unfamiliar with their comedic partnership that was decades before my time. After meeting Gracie here in the cemetery and familiarizing myself more fully with the work of Burns and Allen by watching their 50s TV show, the duo has since become one of my favorite comedy teams in entertainment history. And I love their love story. George and Gracie's partnership began in the 1920s on the vaudeville circuit, where they would sing, dance, and tell jokes. They married shortly thereafter. On stage, George was the straight man, and Gracie became famous for her zany, ditzy character with a penchant for illogical logic and humorous familial anecdotes.
You're too smart for one girl.
I'm more than one.
You're more than one?
Yeah, my mother has a picture of me when I was 2.
They'd go on to star in short films and their own radio program, which they parlayed into a pioneering television sitcom in the 1950s, The George Burns and Gracie Allen Show.
Say goodnight, Gracie.
Good night.
Good night.
Gracie died from a heart ailment in 1964, leaving George devastated, and without his life and creative partner. George never slowed down or retired, however, continuing to appear on stage, TV, and in movies, including winning an Oscar for The Sunshine Boys in 1976 and starring in Oh God. He also never forgot Gracie, visiting her grave every month for 32 years before his death at age 100.
See you next month.
Ensuring Gracie got top billing here on the crypt. It wasn't long in those early years before I made my way to Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Not an easy cemetery to find, to be sure, but almost hidden among tall office and apartment buildings is a tiny cemetery with some of the biggest names in the history of entertainment. And the biggest name here among them is one of the most frequently visited graves in the world, that of Marilyn Monroe. Her career as a model began after being discovered working in a factory during World War II. A film career soon followed, and she chose the stage name Marilyn Monroe after Broadway star Marilyn Miller and her mother's maiden name, Monroe. After a few bit parts in films, her breakout came in the early 50s with roles in All About Eve and John Huston's noir classic, The Asphalt Jungle. Her role may have been small, but they gave her the best line in the movie.
Haven't you bothered me enough, you big banana head?
She quickly rose in popularity in the years that followed. In 1953, her roles in Niagara and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes would make her Hollywood's biggest star.
But diamonds are a girl's best friend.
Her soft, breathy voice, blonde locks, and curvaceous figure made her the quintessential sex symbol of the 50s. Marilyn began to grow tired, though, of the dumb blonde bombshell she had become known for. Despite this on-screen persona, she was very intelligent, well-read, and regarded by many as being a great actress, not just a movie star. She enrolled in the famed Actors Studio in New York to broaden her range and worked towards more serious dramatic roles. She returned to Hollywood in 1958 to star in Some Like It Hot, a role which earned her a Golden Globe for Best Actress. Her final film was The Misfits, written for her by her husband, Arthur Miller, a Valentine, to provide her with a dramatic role. But on the morning of August 5th, 1962, Marilyn was found dead of a drug overdose the night before in her Brentwood home. She was 36. Of all the famous graves I visited in these early years, Marilyn's was the one I was most profoundly moved by. Marilyn Monroe is, after all, one of Hollywood's greatest icons, a larger-than-life figure that embodied the glamour of Hollywood. But she was also Norma Jean, a girl few people really knew, hiding behind the blonde locks and effervescent smile of her manufactured persona. A girl who faced struggles many of us could never understand, and became one of Hollywood's most tragic figures after her death in 1962. Standing here for the first time at her above-ground crypt, knowing the Marilyn Monroe was there, just beyond a few inches of concrete and marble, gone so young, was incredibly moving. We're left here with the haunting thoughts of what might have been. If you've followed our channel, you may have deduced that I have something of a soft spot for animation and music. That brings us up now to San Fernando Mission Cemetery in Mission Hills, north of Los Angeles. Who was your favorite cartoon character growing up? Mine was Donald Duck, and here's the proof.
I got my Donald Duck at Hardee's, and I wanted it so much that we went to Hardee's for my birthday dinner and I got it.
So, as a nod to my younger and much more adorable self, after moving to LA, it became something of a pilgrimage to find the grave of the man who voiced Donald Duck, Clarence "Ducky" Nash. I was tickled pink to discover that Donald Duck was engraved right on his tombstone, with Daisy for his wife. Clarence Nash never set out to be the world's most famous animated duck, once recounting, "I wanted to be a doctor, but instead became the biggest quack in the world." He began at Disney in the 30s doing animal sounds when he was cast as a talking duck in 1934's The Wise Little Hen, Donald Duck's debut. Little did anyone know that this ancillary character would become one of Disney's most enduring and beloved characters, owed in no small part to the incredibly unique voice and personality given him by Clarence Nash. A voice that even Disney acknowledged was sometimes a little difficult to understand. Clarence Nash would voice Donald Duck in animated shorts, feature films, on television, and anywhere Donald could be seen or heard for the span of 50 years, until his death at age 80 from leukemia. Clarence "Ducky" Nash was named a Disney legend in 1993. All celebrity deaths are sad, many are tragic and untimely, but the occasional few send shockwaves across the globe. Such was the case in 2009 when the world lost Michael Jackson. We're back at Forest Lawn Glendale in Los Angeles and the Great Mausoleum, the Westminster Abbey of the West. On the subject of favorites, the Great Mausoleum is my favorite mausoleum in the world. Its beauty, majesty, art, and serenity are an oasis in the hustle and bustle of Hollywood. Sprawling Gothic corridors are painted with colorful light through stained glass windows, like a cathedral plucked right out of Europe and dropped into the middle of Los Angeles to host the ghostly echoes of Hollywood's past. Unfortunately, most sections of the mausoleum have very limited access, the otherworldly beauty reserved principally for the dead. As such, those wanting to leave their tributes to some of the legends entombed therein, like Michael Jackson, Clark Gable, Carole Lombard, Elizabeth Taylor, Ed Wynn, Jean Harlow, and more, leave flowers at the locked entryways, or even scribble messages of love into the dust on the windows. In the Holly Terrace of the Great Mausoleum is an alcove at the end of the Sanctuary of Ascension. Flanked by soaring Gothic arches and colorful stained glass windows is a tomb fit for a king. Beneath this sarcophagus rests the king of pop, Michael Jackson. He got his start as the youngest member of the Jackson 5, a popular musical group featuring Michael and 4 of his older brothers. As Michael grew into his own, he became one of the most prominent figures in popular music through the 70s and 80s. Some of his biggest hits include Thriller, Billie Jean, and Beat It. His 1982 album Thriller remains to date the best-selling album of all time. As he was preparing for his comeback tour, This Is It, in 2009, Michael found it difficult to sleep. His physician began administering dangerous levels of propofol, which eventually led to cardiac arrest and Michael's untimely death. He was just 50. In September 2009, Michael's gold-plated casket was entombed here in this alcove. A rare talent gone too soon. Fans who come here to visit him often land at the entrance to the Holly Terrace, but you can see Michael's sanctuary from the outside, on the west side of the mausoleum here, the tall windows marking his resting place. The intrigue surrounding Michael's elusive and unique final resting place was a major catalyst in sparking my interest in seeking out famous graves. For our next stop, we cross the country to New York to reminisce on our first video shoot in a cemetery covered in snow, something we never see in LA. What brought us out to the rural Lakeview Cemetery in the remote town of Interlaken, New York? This was the cemetery that kicked off our Twilight Zone special back in 2019. When planning that video, the original intent was to go out there in the spring and film with your standard green grass look. But after seeing a picture of the cemetery covered in snow, it looked so fitting for the Twilight Zone, we decided to do it in the winter, when there was snow on the ground and the trees were bare. This complicated the shoot significantly, but it was worth it. Director Nathan D. Lee and I flew out there in February, and Mother Nature was very kind to us on the day we filmed. The cemetery was carpeted in snow, and it was an overcast day, but lightly overcast with enough sunlight getting through for a deliciously hazy and diffused look. Like the sky was a giant softbox. The world itself appeared to be in black and white, just like the original Twilight Zone series. It was perfect. If you haven't seen our Twilight Zone special, the premise is that my visit to the grave of Twilight Zone writer and creator Rod Serling becomes my own journey through the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling began writing for the nascent medium of television in the 50s, rising to prominence with hits like Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight, before surprising audiences with the announcement of a new sci-fi and fantasy series. In that era, sci-fi was seen as a lesser art form, but there was logic behind Serling's decision to stray from straight drama. What the Twilight Zone did was granted him a degree of freedom and creative expression he hadn't enjoyed before. He could write stories that were meaningful to him, but in the context of robots, aliens, and the paranormal, in far-off times and places, he could avoid sponsor and censor interference. The Twilight Zone premiered on October 2nd, 1959, and was an immediate hit. It would run for 5 seasons, and in that time, Rod Serling wrote or adapted 92 of the 156 episodes made. And with his distinctive punctuated voice and cigarette in hand, Serling became the unwitting star of the series as narrator, making cameo appearances at the beginning of most episodes, setting the stage for the unusual events that were about to transpire
in the Twilight Zone.
Rod Serling also wrote for films like Planet of the Apes. Before launching his writing career, Rod served in the Army during World War II in the Pacific Theater, his experiences in the war heavily informing his writing. Rod was one of the all-time great wordsmiths in the annals of Hollywood history, and The Twilight Zone is considered one of the greatest and most influential television shows in history. Rod was just 50 when he died after suffering a heart attack during open-heart surgery. Tributes on his grave here include The Key of Imagination, The Train from a Stop at Willoughby, incidentally my favorite episode, writing pens, and a rock painted like the iconic Twilight Zone opening. It's no exaggeration to say that Rod Serling remains one of my favorite creatives of all time. The summer of 2021 saw my reach expand into Europe when I flew out there for 2 weeks to film cemetery tours of Italy, Switzerland, and Paris. This was a fun trip because it was the first time Hollywood graveyard composer Giuseppe Vassapoli joined me for filming, since he lives in Italy. These European cemeteries were absolutely spectacular, and 2 of the sites on my list today are actually found in Switzerland. Around the town of Coursier-sur-Vevey near Lake Geneva, you'll find homages to this city's most famous former resident. You know who he is, the legendary Charlie Chaplin. Perhaps no name and no character, his little tramp, have come to symbolize classic cinema more than that of Charlie Chaplin. We're now at the Cimetière de Coursier-sur-Vevey, where Chaplin is laid to rest. Charlie was born in England and began performing early, touring music halls, learning music and acting. By his late teens, he found himself in America, where he would begin to appear in silent comedies for Keystone Studios. It was here that he developed his tramp persona, the hobo with a bowler cap, too small jacket, too large pants, a toothbrush mustache, and a bamboo cane. Chaplin's tramp first appeared in 1914's Mabel's Strange Predicament alongside Mabel Normand. This character would spring Chaplin into worldwide popularity, appearing in dozens of films as the endearing tramp. As his popularity grew, Chaplin would write, direct, and produce his own films. He would even co-found United Artists to distribute his films. Among them are beloved classic titles like The Kid and Modern Times, which was made as a silent well after the dawn of the talkies. Chaplin's first true sound film came in the form of 1940's The Great Dictator, which satirized and condemned Hitler and fascism. It's considered among the greatest films of all time. In addition to producing and starring in his own films, Chaplin was also a talented musician and wrote the musical scores for many of his films. You may be surprised to know that the only competitive Oscar that he won was for his music for the film Limelight. In 1972, just a few years before his death, Charlie Chaplin was awarded an honorary Academy Award for his incalculable effect on motion pictures. The ceremony, in which he received a 12-minute standing ovation, was a warm homecoming of sorts for Chaplin, who in the late 40s, early 50s had essentially been banned from the United States because of the Red Scare, when he was falsely accused of being a communist. It was then that he settled here in Switzerland with his wife Una. He died after suffering a stroke at age 88. I was so awestruck being here at the grave of Charlie Chaplin in beautiful Switzerland, the rain didn't even faze me. Further west along Lake Geneva is a quiet Swiss town called Toloschina. This is Toloschina Cemetery, a humble little cemetery in the countryside with barely more than 100 graves. If you look carefully, among the names you'll see here is one of the most famous in the world. She was an actress, a fashion icon, and a humanitarian. She personified grace, beauty, and goodness. She was the one and only Audrey Hepburn. She was born in Belgium and from a young age began to perform on stage as an actress in musical theater. Her big break came when William Wyler was looking for an unknown to play Princess Anne in Roman Holiday. After a screen test, Audrey was cast for her charm, innocence, and talent. Her talent did not go unnoticed by the film world. She won an Oscar for the role. She was nominated an additional 4 times for her roles in those timeless classics Sabrina, The Nun's Story, Wait Until Dark, and what is perhaps her most iconic role as Holly Golightly in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Who are all these people anyhow?
Who knows? The word gets out. You don't mind, do you, darling?
She's also remembered for playing Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
And on stage, she won a Tony for her role in the play Ondine. She's one of only a handful of entertainers to have won the coveted EGOT, an Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. Audrey only had around 30 credits to her name, having dedicated much of her life and time to also being a wife and mother. She also devoted much of her time to UNICEF, an organization focused on providing humanitarian aid to children around the world, particularly in the poorest countries. For her work as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The house Audrey lived in for 30 years is just down the street. It was known as La Paisible, which means peaceful. Peace is exactly what Audrey Hepburn found here in Toloschina, balancing fame and family, glamour and charity. In 1992, Audrey Hepburn was diagnosed with cancer. She died in her sleep on January 20th, 1993, at the age of 63. For me, Audrey Hepburn was one of the most beautiful women inside and out who has ever lived, and visiting her in such a unique location was truly something special. Funny story about our visit to Audrey Hepburn. When we arrived in Toloschina, it was overcast and rainy. In most scenarios, I love the rainy, overcast look for filming in graveyards. However, Audrey Hepburn was such a ray of sunshine, it didn't feel right for her. We needed sunshine. But what can one do about the weather? And we were on a tight schedule, so I got the shots and we moved on toward Geneva. While filming Richard Burton's grave at the old cemetery in Serling, the clouds parted and the sun came out. I asked Giuseppe, who was driving on this trip, if he would hate me if I asked him to double back to Audrey Hepburn's grave, about 30 minutes away, so we could film it again. He wasn't a fan of the idea, but kindly acquiesced, and back we went to film Audrey Hepburn's grave a second time, this time with sunshine and blue skies. Before the final entry on my list, let's take a moment to acknowledge some honorable mentions, because limiting it to 10 was just too hard. I could go on like this indefinitely, but we'd better leave it there and finish out my top 10. The final grave of my top 10 was one that had topped my list for years to visit. When I finally got out there, I was so excited I actually filmed myself walking up to it for the first time.
This is a very big moment for me, you guys. This is my very first time ever seeing and visiting the grave of Edgar Allan Poe.
That's right, Edgar Allan Poe, who rests in the grounds of Westminster Hall in Baltimore, Maryland. My first time visiting Edgar was in the summer of 2021 when Nathan and I went out there to scout the locations for our Edgar Allan Poe special. It was a very complicated film shoot since it was part narrative and would be done at night, so we needed to see the locations in person to prepare for the actual shoot, which we did later in the fall. Not long after first showing up here in the graveyard, the heavens opened up and it began pouring a torrential rain like I'd never experienced before. We had no umbrellas and were wholly unprepared for it. While it left us soaked to the bone and running like imbeciles, it did make for some pretty sweet footage. We came back for the actual film shoot in early November to get a nice autumnal look. We were fortunate enough to have connected with one of the caretakers of the graveyard who allowed us to shoot at night. Our story required a certain amount of Poe-like spookiness, so filming at night was a must and was such a treat. Like our Twilight Zone special, the premise of our Edgar Allan Poe special was that when I visit the grave of Poe, I become haunted by the ghosts of his past, and the grave tour becomes its own Edgar Allan Poe-like ghost story. Edgar Allan Poe's name alone conjures up images of ravens, beating hearts, disturbed graves, undead women, and bereaved lovers. A key figure of dark romanticism, Poe is a master of gothic horror, mystery, and the macabre, remembered for poems like The Raven, The Bells, and Annabel Lee, and short stories like The Telltale Heart and The Pit and the Pendulum. But Poe is also considered the father of the modern detective story, his fictional Inspector C. Auguste Dupin, a predecessor of the likes of Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. Tales like The Murders in the Rue Morgue thrilled Victorian audiences through Poe's genius use of ratiocination. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, said, "Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it?" But perhaps the greatest mystery America's first mystery writer left us was the mystery surrounding his own death. On October 3rd, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found on the streets of Baltimore outside a tavern, delirious and in great distress. Half frozen and out of his mind, Poe was taken to the hospital, but never regained enough lucidity to explain his condition. He died 4 days later at the age of 40. His death certificate has been lost and no official cause of death determined. Despite being one of the most well-known writers of his day, Poe died in poverty. There was little ceremony at his funeral, attended by only about 8 people and lasting only a few minutes. He was originally buried in a simple mahogany coffin near this spot in the Westminster Burial Ground here in Baltimore. The grave remained unmarked. Decades later, a local teacher and school children raised funds to have a permanent monument to Poe created. In the 1870s, Poe was exhumed and moved to a place of prominence near the front gate, where this monument now stands. He rests alongside his beloved wife, Virginia, who heavily influenced his writings. For a more in-depth look into the life and writings of Edgar Allan Poe, be sure to check out our film, The Graves of Edgar Allan Poe and the Women Who Haunted Him. And that concludes my top 10 famous graves. I look forward to reading your favorite famous grave stories in the comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.